This is the Legacy of the Industrial Revolution Objective 1 about the legacies of the Industrial Revolution in America. Now, where we want to start here is with the time frame. The argument could be made that the Industrial Revolution in America takes place in the late 1790s when Samuel Slater and Moses Brown start the first American factory. But the reality is that it was relatively slow from that point until the 1850 to 1900 time period. That's when it really kicks into high gear. Now, we did have industry here before 1850, but 1850 to 1900, especially the post-Civil War era, is when things really start to boom in terms of American industry and people really making a significant move from the agricultural farmlands to the urban factories. Now, prior to the Civil War, agriculture was the nation's big business. But after the Civil War, revolutions in various industries are going to make us much more industrial than we had been before. We've already taken a look at revolutions in the railroad industry, and I just want to do a side note here. Here's a picture from a museum. This is something I didn't show you in the railroad study, but I think it's pretty cool. This is called a round table or a roundabout. If you were ever wondering how they would get a train turned around to go back in the other direction, well, this is how. Matter of fact, there were some houses that held lots of trains, and they would be escorted out to the roundabout and get pointed in various directions at any point along this track. There are pictures along there if you want to take a look online, but this is your basic roundabout that would exist. A lot of advancements like this took place in the late 1800s, not just with the railroad itself, but actually the roundabout, round table, and getting trains steered in the other direction. Of course, we also know that we saw a major revolution in the oil industry during this particular time. Major revolutions took place in the steel industry under Carnegie. And various inventors wanted to come up with all sorts of different things to try to sell. Even bicycles like this. But one of the real keys as we get into the late 1800s is the idea of investment in a lot of these inventions, as J.P. Morgan had done. And overall, the mass production of items as opposed to things that were being created just in people's shops. Now, as you remember, you've seen this slide before. This was primarily true in the Northeast, where you have the eventual automobile industry that took place in this general region, and the metals or the steel industry that took place right in this region, or the coal mining regions, or whatever the case may be. America, in this particular part, starts to be known as the Rust Belt. In other words, all of the old industries in America. The Rust Belt, like we had mentioned before, looks like this today. Basically factories that had been around since the late 1800s, early 1900s, combined with a lot of snow and ice, really does not leave a whole lot of fond images of the Rust Belt itself. And it was all the old industries in America. These industries that we previously mentioned, along with coal, natural gas, rubber, and gas, and various others, are considered the old industries in the country today. So what did we get from the Industrial Revolution that was good? Well, by 1900, industry was over half of the American economy. Around about that time, by 1900, America had become an industrial giant in the world economy. Here's a really interesting political cartoon, Uncle Sam's Department Store, as you can see over here, as various nations in the world are lining up to get all sorts of supplies from Uncle Sam, including clothing, scientific instruments, chemicals, agricultural stuff, provisions, machinery, all sorts of different things. Steel rails were coming from America. Railroads, tools, grain down here. It had gotten to the point where America was the, again, industrial giant in the world economy. So what did this do for America? What is the legacy of the American Industrial Revolution and the results of this, or the effects of this? Well, first of all, this enormously increased America's wealth overall. This is a really interesting old mansion from the 1800s out west, as you can see from the palm tree here that's been brought in. But in any event, across the board, we started seeing the number of millionaires going up considerably. Not everybody was, of course, but we saw an increased amount than we had seen before the Civil War. And everybody's standard of living, it seemed like, was starting to rise. Americans were now more comfortable than they had been prior to the Civil War. Again, not all Americans, we'll get into that in a later lesson, but as a general rule, the standard of living in America had basically gone up. And finally, the Industrial Revolution made us a power in the world at that time with our new Navy and our new expansionist policies, both in terms of gaining territory and doing things economically around the world. The late 1800s was a very big time for us. We'll expand on that a lot more in the spring when we study expansionism. As for this picture, I just thought it was really cool. It makes us look like a leading world power, I guess you could say. But all in all, it's just kind of a cool picture. But while there were a lot of good things that came from the Industrial Revolution in America in the late 1800s, there were some things that came along with it that caused problems as well. Agriculture, for example, was still important in the United States, but it was definitely declining to be a more minor part of American production during this time. Also, the rise in big business inevitably led to corruption in big business, especially as some of the tycoons started to influence politicians. Many would say that that's something that still continues today. And there were various environmental concerns. As the earth started to get drilled into and dug into, trees were starting to get cut down. Pollutants were being pumped into the air and into the ground and into the water. It became a pretty common sight as the environment took a pretty heavy hit during this time. Gasoline, for example, we know in all the years that Rockefeller was producing kerosene, the gasoline byproduct was not really stored or burned off. It was just dumped into lakes and rivers. When you take a look at all the environmental factors that are involved with industrial production, especially in the late 1800s, and how these things were just kind of pumped into the air and into the ground and into the water. We didn't replenish trees we were cutting down, things like that. These are the kind of things that are going to make a negative legacy and last for a long time. In future lessons, we're going to be talking about how some of these chemicals, after decades of being in the ground, basically saturated the ground and started to bubble up in the 1970s in toxic waste dumps that became exposed after decades of environmental waste being pumped into them. That all starts in the late 1800s. So in the end, there are a lot of good and bad things that come from the Industrial Revolution at this time. As far as the environmental concerns, at the time, no one really thought much about what the future would bring. Everybody was kind of just enamored with how good industry was and what it was doing for the country. So ultimately, when it's all said and done, is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution a positive one or a negative one? That's really kind of up to each one of us to decide for ourselves. And that really is the biggest question we have to ask. Was the legacy of the Industrial Revolution positive or negative? Okay, that's basically it. Thanks again for listening.